Hello, my name is Alex Isles, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a dragon. Now, when I said we were going to be talking about a dragon, I don't think you expected to be talking about this little fella here. And in today's video, this is our April the 1st video, so if you know what that means, it's April Fool's Day. But we're going to be talking about Zog, written by Julia Donaldson, and how we should interpret him through an early medieval and medieval perspective. So I hope you're ready for this, and why not we get started straight away. So just to set the scene for some of you who don't know, Zog is a book for children. And basically, when my little one was born, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law bought it for us and gave it to us. And it is a story about a dragon, a princess, and a knight. And I'm going to go through each of those characters in turn. And the story starts off with Zog, who is a young dragon, and he goes to dragon school. And over 5 years, he's taught by Madam Dragon to learn all the things that the young dragons need to know. Over those 5 years, he is then exposed to various different things where he learns about his skills and abilities, and eventually he is sent out and he has to kidnap a princess, whereupon we meet our next character, Princess Pearl. Now, Princess Pearl is far less than keen at being a princess. She then willingly allows herself to be kidnapped by Zog and then goes away, but her passion is actually medicine, and she wants to be a doctor. So because of this, Princess Pearl trains up to be a doctor. She goes off and lives with the dragons for a year. And then when she's away, her kingdom then sends the brave knight Sir Gadabout the Great to go and fight the dragons and to rescue Princess Pearl. And so that's an overview of the story. We'll go into some of the little bit more of the interesting bits and bobs about that as we go on. But I wanted to look at Zog from the early medieval perspective and the medieval perspective. So we'll start off with our first character, Zog, and talk about him. So as the story starts, I've already mentioned, the story begins with saying, Madam Dragon ran a school many years ago. She taught young dragons all the things that dragons need to know. Now, if you were an early medieval kingdom or a medieval kingdom, or even just a person from that time, that should send pure terror down your spine and absolutely terrify you. Because today, when we look at dragons, we have a very different perspective of dragons than you do in this of medieval perspective or in the early medieval perspective. Today, we have films like How to Train Your Dragon, or dragons are romanticized by things like Game of Thrones and stuff like that. But within the ancient world, dragons had many different meanings. And a really good example of this is to start off with the early medieval Anglo-Saxon perspective with the story Beowulf. Now in Beowulf, the main part of the story is with Beowulf fighting against Amanda Grendel, Grendel's mother, and then he becomes a famous hero and then ultimately a king. At the end of the story, his kingdom is then assaulted by a dragon because one of his retainers has broken into the dragon's cave, stolen some of its treasure, and the dragon is now vengeful, goes out, attacks Beowulf's kingdom, and in the end, Beowulf is left fighting the dragon on his own. His retainers have fled except for one loyal retainer. And then finally, Beowulf manages to slay the dragon and is left dying with his one loyal retainer. And then when he's left to die, he's then cremated at the end. And that gives you a rough overview of the Beowulf story very, very quickly. Now, when we look at it, dragons within the early medieval perspective are not some sort of benevolent creature or something that can be tamed or anything. They actually represent the worst aspects of humanity. They are selfish, violent, greedy, destructive, individualistic, entirely inward looking, and they hoard their treasure. And they're supposed to be a mirror for any early medieval king to look at and to warn against poor behavior. Dragons are meant to be a mirror for early and medieval kingship because they're supposed to show the exact opposite of what the king is supposed to be. So as an early medieval king, you're supposed to be generous. You're supposed to give out land, titles, and money to your retainers. You're supposed to build a good war band around you who can defend your kingdom, but also do offensive wars as well to earn more treasure, more glory, attract more young men to your cause, and to build your kingdom. Alongside this as well, you're supposed to give out treasure. And by giving out treasure, you are then earning loyalty, but also helping other people to then then give out to their retainers and to make sure your kingdom is strong and stable. So everything, when you look at the sort of perspective of dragons from Beowulf, you know, they're seen as a very destructive creature, and alongside that as well, they're also seen to sort of curse their treasure, and their malice is imbued into the treasure that they gather. When their malice is imbued into their treasure, it then affects those who take it, and it makes them like the dragon as well. And a good example of this from 20th century literature would be Smaug in The Hobbit, written by J.R.R. Tolkien, obviously more famous for The Lord of the Rings. But Smaug, and also if you think of it in the film version as well, where he's voiced by Benedict Cumberbatch, has gathered together all of these dwarfs' treasures. He's gathered them together and he sleeps upon all the treasure. He keeps it to himself, and he's hoarded all of this treasure into one place. And so he is a good representation, because his malice and things like that is imbued into the treasure, and then affects the dwarfs as well. And it affects the way they interact with each other, making them more selfish, more greedy, and more inward looking. So there's an interesting one for you there. So when you're thinking of, from an early medieval perspective, if a school for dragons was set up near to your settlement, you would be quite concerned. Following on from this, if we look into this into the medieval perspective, we've got the famous medieval story of St. George and the Dragon. Now, St. George actually starts off in the Roman period because he's thought to be an actual historical character. We think he was a Roman centurion who converted to Christianity and then was imprisoned. And when he was imprisoned, apparently the emperor's sister came to him. He preached the message of Christianity and salvation to the emperor's sister, and she converted and became a Christian. Because of that, her brother imprisoned her in a tower for the rest of her life, and St. George was executed, I believe, by crucifixion. Now, when he was executed for his faith, you might go, well, that doesn't sound like the St. George and the Dragon story that I know. But you have to think about it within a medieval Christian perspective. So to start off with, the dragon is meant to be the devil, because if you think about the Garden of Eden, the devil was represented as a serpent. So a dragon is just a serpent with wings attached. And obviously you have the fire, which is also representing the danger of, you know, damnation and things like that. And so this is the image of the dragon now we're now building up. So when the dragon is the devil, when in the story of St. George, we think of the princess being inside a tower. And when the princess is inside the tower, St. George rides out, slays the dragon, saves her, brings her back to the kingdom, and all is saved. So to sort of looking at it this way, St. George, by bringing the message of salvation to the emperor's sister, helps her to be saved, saves her from eternal damnation, saves her and gives her the joy of salvation. And by giving her the joy of salvation, she is then able to be entered into the sort of the Christian community and obviously into heaven. And St. George, by his martyrdom, has triumphed over the devil, has triumphed over evil, and therefore has won against the evil of Satan. And so that's how the message and the story mutated over time to becoming the knight killing the dragon. And that's how we know it today. But in both ways, if we think about it, if Zog's School for Dragons was in a medieval context, what you've got going on there is an entire community of devils actually on your doorstep. And that would be quite a scary one for a medieval community as well. But also if we think of it as the more romantic medieval story, then as well, at the same time, this is also quite a serious matter, because you've got a large group of flying, fire-breathing lizards on your doorstep, and that is quite terrifying. Another thing I'd like to point out from Julia Donaldson's story is that every year the dragons are motivated to win a golden star for their performances as they learn their various skills. Now, I don't know about you, but thinking of that within the Beowulf allegory, you know, of rewarding treasure, and these creatures are by nature violent, greedy, destructive, individualistic, and inward looking, I don't think rewarding them with stars and then saying, well, you didn't make the cut is the best way of doing this. This might make them very dangerous to the local community around them, but that may have been Madame Dragon's intent if we look at it that way. Now, moving on next, we look at Zog's development, because from year 1 to 5, he develops new skills. So in year 1, Zog learns to fly, though like most toddlers, he's not yet balanced and he crashes into a tree. Then in the second year, he learns how to roar, but then he overuses it and learns, and then now wears out his throat and mates Princess Pearl, and she then gives him a little peppermint to suck, which restores his ability to speak. Then in year 3, what happens is he learns to breathe out fire, and we also learn that dragons are also able to breathe out snow as well. And then in year 4, capture a princess, and in year 5, fight. But one of the interesting things is that when he learns to breathe fire, one of the instances is that he learns to breathe fire, he's flying through the air, and he blows fire, breathes fire out, and manages to set his wingtip alight. Now, I don't know about you or where you stand on evolution or things like that, but I think that's an evolutionary flaw right there, because of the fact that any creature that breathes fire should probably be resistant to fire in its own right. And so that's a serious design flaw for dragons, but that's just a little bit of humor on my part. I definitely felt for Zog on that front. We're setting his own wingtip alight, and that Zog is set up by the end of those 5 years to be a serious apex predator. And so when you're thinking about that, dragons are a terrifying creature for anyone to have to deal with nearby. Now we'll move on to our next character, Princess Pearl. So here we have our next character, Princess Pearl. Now, Princess Pearl, to our modern audience, is very well developed because she is compassionate, caring, has a desire to help, she's intelligent, and also alongside that wants to be a doctor. To our modern audiences, if she was around in our world, she'd find a great job within a charity, a medical organization, maybe even Doctors Without Borders. She is an amazing person for our modern world. Unfortunately, in early medieval or medieval world, she's a liability and is quite likely the reason why her kingdom is going to be devoured by a horde of fire-breathing flying lizards. Now, you may say, Alex, that doesn't sound very progressive, but while I'm just talking about this, I want you to have an open mind and understand I'm speaking within the perspective of the early medieval society and medieval society as well. Now, when Pearl describes herself, she describes her job as a princess as prancing around in palaces in a silly frilly dress. And she's massively misunderstood her role within the medieval and early medieval world. Now, as an early medieval or a medieval princess, she would have been educated in numerous languages, understood history, known her family's tree and key members of other dynasties in the surrounding geopolitical region. She would have been educated in art, music, and public speaking. Our Pearl, at least in the cinematic version put out on the BBC, doesn't seem to be very interested in any of her studies, just interested in medicine. Now, you may be going, oh, that's, Alex, you're starting to tread on toes here. But I want you to have a think about this. Within the early medieval society, we actually see that women were actually very important within the role of that society. We've seen from grave goods that there were definitely within the 5th and 6th centuries high-ranking women throughout the whole of Northern Europe who not only were in princesses' roles but also in spiritual roles, both within the Christian and in the non-Christian, the pagan context, where we see women buried with high-status magic items and also the philanthropy so that they could do magical works within a pagan context, and also high-status princess burials for the Christian side of the coin as well. So their role was actually to go through society and help to band together these societies. They were there to help to create peace during feasts. They were supposed to create good friendships between their male brothers and also possibly cousins or other members of kingdoms, help to build retainers, give good advice, steer people when they were in the feast situations where lots of alcohol and fighting could have been possible due to the high amounts of alcohol and testosterone and young men wanting to prove themselves, but with a combination of poetry, humor, and responsibility, steer these people towards the best alliances possible so that the kingdoms would develop, so that there would be the benefit for all. And alongside that, through things like marriage, helping to create stable alliances and future generations as well. So these were highly important women within the societies. And also alongside this as well, we see during Christianization that they didn't just have to get married. We see actually high status political women within the kingdom of Northumbria actually setting up monasteries. A good example would be St. Hild, and Hild herself, She was actually related to the royal family of Northumbria, and she set up a number of different monasteries and churches throughout the northeast. So we can see again how these very powerful, very important women didn't just have to have a lifestyle where they were just bound to being married and then just producing children. No, they had a lot more responsibility than that, and they had a lot more influence as well than people seem to understand through the lens of history, which is quite often Victorian. When we look at them within the context of their period, these are very powerful women in their own rights. Also, looking at the medieval, so going from 1066 onwards, we see that the medieval women were also highly powerful. It wasn't just in the early Middle Ages or the Dark Ages when we see women having power, but for instance, we have a look at Matilda of Flanders, the wife of William the Conqueror. When William went off to war, he left England and Normandy in her hands and let her rule them. So you can see a very powerful woman there. Empress Matilda, who was obviously a highly powerful woman who'd married into the dynasties of Germany and then came back across to become Queen of England. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and important women within the medieval story for the actual context of what was going on. And also women like Margaret of Anjou as well. So all of these are fantastic examples of female powerful rulers, and I'd suggest going away and having a look at each of them because they held political power in their own right in England and in France and in other places in the world as well. And they were fantastic examples of powerful female rulers. And there's sure, if you went through other places in the world, you'd see wonderful examples of female rulers as well. So what I'm saying about this is that Pearl has made a mistake of reducing her worth just purely down to her aesthetics, and she's actually written off her mental abilities, her responsibilities, and the power she would have had, as well as the fact that her marriage would have likely secured an alliance with another kingdom, which would be highly important when this entire group of dragons comes down on their kingdom, causing raids and likely destruction. And this is, in my opinion, why in the book that in year 4, the dragons learn to capture princesses, because when you capture a princess, you take away the connections between various different medieval and early medieval kingdoms, therefore causing for instability and fighting. So you can see here, Madame Dragon definitely understands the geopolitical understandings of the early medieval and medieval kingdoms, and she is actually doing her best to try and destabilize that whole system right there. I'd also like to look at the fact that Pearl is really interested in being a doctor. Her grasp of medicine, at least in the first book, we will talk maybe another time about Zog and the Flying Doctors, the follow-on book, is a little bit to be desired due to the fact that when she actually gives out her medical abilities, she can apply plasters, bandages, give pharmaceuticals, and alongside that, take the dragon's temperatures, which, by the way, I am most impressed with, because creatures that breathe fire and snow, and you're actually able to put a thermometer inside the mouth of a fire-breathing lizard and actually take a good reading and not have that melt inside the creature's mouth. That shows some amazing skill, and also possibly amazing skill at chemistry as well to actually create something like that. So well done to Pearl there. She gets full marks in my book for that one. But what we actually see is that she is then taking all of these things on, and we have to have an understanding of early medieval or medieval medicine. Now, what we have to look at is the Anglo-Saxon leech books, and these were medical texts and pharmaceutical reference manuals. They combined astronomy, pharmacy, and some good sound medicine to create a system that has combined both the Roman medical system and also common understanding of medicine from within the early medieval period, or what people call the Dark Ages. Now, many people, when they look at this, they just write it off as cures for broken bones, some herbal remedies, and even some sort of things like that. But we actually know from looking at the leech books that they even had some forms of antibiotics in there. Now, obviously, back then, they didn't recognize them as antibiotics, but they would have just seen the fact that they were curing people for certain illnesses. So when you've got that there, you have to understand that there were some good things, but there were also some negative things about this medical work as well. For instance, in one of the leech books, I believe a particular cure for blindness is to rub dog feces in your eyes, which obviously would definitely not help. So we can understand that while there was some good medical textbook advice, there was also some very poor medical textbook advice in there as well. Now, while we see Pearl applying plasters, bandages, and also giving some basic pharmaceuticals to the dragons, we don't actually see any of her other medical skills. And we just see that she expresses that she wants to become a doctor and she wants to give people her care. So because of that, we can't actually draw too many parallels from this. But while I was preparing for this video, a friend of mine did point out that simply by fulfilling her duties as an early medieval princess or a medieval princess, she probably would have saved more lives than her medicine would have done by having a marriage alliance that would protect the kingdom against a horde of fire-breathing flying lizards that are bound to come down upon the kingdom in near time. And by actually opting to being captured by Zog, she actually places her kingdom in true peril and she undermines her true potential. But I'll leave it up to you to decide in the comments what you think about my summary on that part. Now I'll have a look at our third character, Sir Gadabout the Great. So right here we have our third character, Sir Gadabout, and immediately I can appreciate the man is trying his hardest with his facial hair, but he's already on a losing streak because the poor man's name means a habitual pleasure seeker, a gadabout. And so we already know that poor Gadabout here hasn't got the best start as a character introduction. Now, when we have a look at him, we can presume that he's got all the knightly training that we would expect, but it maybe hasn't gone to plan. He too would have been highly educated, just like Pearl, and he would have been trained in how to speak various languages. He would have known Latin, poetry, dancing, possibly some form of art as well as having his martial skills. But I don't think very well of Gadabout, because if you've actually ever watched the BBC iPlayer adaptation of Zog or read the books, Gadabout turns up on his horse and immediately dismounts and chooses to use his hand-and-a-half sword against the dragon rather than his crouched lance. Now, had he used his lance, he may have had a chance against Zog, because his only advantage against a dragon would be to actually come at the dragon very fast with a crouch lance and try and pierce its scales with the lance. Unfortunately, he decides to walk straight at the dragon with a hand-and-a-half sword and decides to go for fighting it with a sword in close combat rather than using a lance. Unfortunately, I think to most dragons, knights are only tin food waiting to be heated up. So I wouldn't have stood much of a chance had Pearl not intervened and told them not to fight each other, as you see within the books. So because of that, we can see that Gadabout maybe hasn't got the best tactical or strategic acumen, and instead has decided to march straight into a combat, and he wouldn't have done very well. What we do know from the book, though, is that Gadabout, when placed with the opportunity of actually swapping over to become a doctor, straight away accepts it and says, I would much prefer to use, I much prefer to be a doctor, and he would much prefer to have a nice twisty stethoscope around his neck rather than actually being an armed knight. And as I've mentioned before, with his training, the transition from being a knight to being a doctor wouldn't have been a very hard one for Gadabout. It would have actually been quite easy due to his understanding of Latin, and therefore he would have been able to understand the Leech books, and therefore being trained up by Princess Pearl as a doctor would have been a good step for him, and actually would have possibly preserved his life. As we can see, he doesn't seem to be a very well suited to the martial life that he has actually got instead. And so because of that, I would say that probably Gadabout is very lucky to become a doctor as a part of the Flying Doctors team, rather than staying within the military profession as a knight. Now, alongside this as well, I would also like to point out that the stethoscope was actually invented in 1816 by René Lanelec, which therefore makes it an anachronism for this case. Because when we look at Zog, the book, we can actually see that it's set within a fantasy medieval world. But I'm sure I can give them that one due to the fact, obviously, it's a fantastical world and has flying dragons in it. And to the best of my understanding, I haven't seen dragons within our world, so we can give them that one there. And that's perfectly all right in my book. To conclude, at the end of the story, they all decide that they're going to become flying doctors, and Zog becomes their air ambulance, transporting them around the kingdom and around the world. So because of that, they then transition, and at the back there you can see Sir Gadabout, now without his armor. You can see Pearl and Zog in the foreground right here. And so they go off to practice medicine around the whole of the kingdom for the benefit of people who live around there. Now, when they go off to do their medical careers, there's one character who I do feel for, and this is Sir Ganabout's horse, who is taken by Madam Dragon, and then Madam Dragon turns around and says, "Stay and be my pupil's pet, and I will feed you lots of hay." Now, unfortunately, I did a wee bit of research about this, and a medieval warhorse weighs about 450 to 500 kilos each. So unfortunately, I feel that Madam Dragon is probably planning to feed this poor horse to her pupils before they begin their final attack upon the kingdom. Now weakened by the lack of a strong princess and down one of its knights, the kingdom will be overwhelmed by flying, fire-breathing dragons within a short period of time, causing for the destruction of this nation. Ultimately, though, I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's been something slightly different to what I've done normally, but I hope it still caused you to have a little bit of a chuckle, as this is my April Fool's video. And I've been trying my hardest to think of something that would entertain, but also bring to light a little bit of both the medieval and also the early medieval period through the use of a children's storybooks. So if you do like my content, please do like and subscribe, share it with your friends, and I hope you'll join us again. And who knows, maybe we'll do Zog and the Flying Doctors as another episode next year on April Fools, or possibly I'll come up with something better. In the meantime, though, I hope your pranks are going well, that you're having fun, and that you're all having a good laugh. So stay safe and well, and look forward to speaking to you in the near future. Goodbye.